So now we want to see how Kant applies his idea of the synthetic a priori to Hume's problem. So to break down the diagram a bit, above the line here, we have our impressions or our experiences, the things we're actually taking in through the senses. And below the line, we have the objects themselves in the mind-independent external world that correspond to the experience. So as you see a red billiard ball and there's an image in your mind of a red billiard ball, that is supposedly corresponding to a red billiard ball out there in the world. Now, we have these constant connections, according to Hume, between, say, having an impression of a red billiard ball moving, having a second impression of a red billiard ball hitting a black billiard ball, and then a third impression of the second billiard ball moving. And because this sequence of impressions rolls out in this way so many times, we start to form a habit of connecting the movement of a red billiard ball with the movement of the second billiard ball. And we start to think that the constant connection between these impressions corresponds to a causal relation between the actual objects in the world. But Hume says we never actually observe the causal connections. All we can observe are the impressions of the billiard balls themselves. So because Hume was an empiricist, he says everything we know about comes ultimately from what we can observe. And since we can't observe the connection between these things, we don't actually know about causality through any kind of rational argument. It's just a habit. Every time I have an impression like this, I come to expect these two impressions to follow. And so then I get in the habit of tying my experiences together with these necessary connections between experiences. But I don't actually have a rational argument for why that should correspond to any mind-independent form of causality out here in the mind-independent external world. So if it's just a habit, then if we had a different kind of mind or a different kind of brain, then we would have a different kind of experience. And Kant thinks that that is a kind of relativism. Suppose we were aliens and we had a different setup in our brain, then we might not ever come to form the idea of causality at all. That means our whole science of causality is relative to our psychological makeup. That's why I called Hume a kind of psychologist, in that he grounds knowledge in our psychology. And that to Kant is a kind of skepticism that he can't accept. So how does Kant propose to solve this problem? Well, Hume had assumed that we would have to derive the idea of causality from our impressions. But Kant says it's kind of the other way around. So Kant says in order for there to be any experience at all that even seems to present us with an outside world, we need to have the categories that outline the necessary connection between experiences. So we don't derive the idea of causality from experience. Rather, we derive experience from the idea of causality. So it's not causality in the mind-independent external world that Kant is thinking of. Causality for Kant is an a priori category of possible experience. In order for a billiard ball to even appear at all, we have to already have the idea of a causal connection between objects. So he says causal connection between objects is a part of the form of experience. So the idea of causality is intrinsic to our form of subjectivity. And without that orderly connection between our experiences, no experience could come about at all. So it's inconceivable to just have, say, random perceptions of billiard balls. Rather, in order to even look like there's a billiard ball in front of you, these necessary connections between experiences have to be in place. So what Kant is doing here is pointing out a crucial distinction between in the way our appearances work. So how do our appearances work at all? We need to further break that down. And Kant notices that there's a matter and a form in our experiences. So the matter is what's sort of inside the thought bubbles, and the form is what's connecting the thought bubbles together. And the form of our experience is a necessary feature of experience. It's not based just on our psychology, our habit. It has to be there for the stuff inside the thought bubbles to even show up at all.